Hello, in this video I want to continue some of the conversation that we were having the last one we began our conversation about accelerationism. Like I said in the last video, if you haven't, you definitely should tune into some of the other conversations that we've had about accelerationism and the intro to accelerationism itself if you haven't even heard of the term before, because I think just having some of the general background for a lot of the stuff that we want to talk about going into these next couple of videos is really important. And also I think that like as it's kind of worked with the other series, if you haven't tuned in, the videos always kind of like build on top of each other and work with kind of like some of the topics and knowledge that I talk about through each video, so you kind of need to watch them in tandem in order to really get, I think, a full perspective of like what I'm thinking about these arguments, because like just the time that I'm working within is kind of like so small that it's really hard to get like a full, really worked out set of ideas. But I do really kind of want to give you like that access to tools that are like quick, instructional, and allow you to kind of figure out the base kind of things that you need to do in order to like execute or be able to understand this argument well enough to be able to resolve some of the key kind of like contentious places that are in the flow and not just get thrown off by the fact that you're hearing the word accelerationism. I think that when you're specifically kind of drawing on some of the stuff that we talked about in the last couple videos, where we kind of talked about the difference between how accelerationism is kind of framing some of the key questions of the debate and the way that that relates to the way in which policy teams want to weigh their offense, I think that you can kind of start to see a reason why the ability to kind of like fold around this differential usage of like the futurity and the idea of like an anti-state futurity in the way in which I think a lot of left-leaning accelerationism can be extremely potent in terms of how you can really like forward a differential way for judges to both evaluate the debate, but also I think it's really important for you to be able to kind of use this as a skill for how you want to frame the major contentions that your offense will make. I think that the idea that just like an anti-state version of the future doesn't allow like, differential versions of like what the way in which will kind of create the world look like, or like the way in which you can create points of offense will look like. But I think that you can diversify a lot of these visions and a lot of the offense that you want if you were able to kind of like move towards a vision of thinking about like why the state at kind of like a core function requires the process of dispossession, and therefore think about like how a new world would have to kind of get rid of all these other institutional facets of the state in order for it to kind of become what will eventually be the world alternative, and what I think will kind of frame a lot of the stuff that we're talking about here. I think that when you're generally talking about the link debate as it relates to accelerationism, this is a place where I think that this criticism can actually be pretty strong, not only because I think that you access a lot of the normative critiques that people would make in relationship to just reading a cap K, which I think is like plentiful when you're thinking about the water resolution as a whole, but I also think that when you're thinking about just like in general accelerationism as a set of arguments, I think there are a lot of arguments to be made about like, especially when the 1AC is kind of like seated that it's centering itself around tech and around like these like distribution of natural resources, that the way in which like institutions kind of like manage and make that kind of like management possible is like both unethical, but also is one in which like requires like the creation and usage of like these other routes and avenues for how the technology gets implemented that increases like the risk of privatization and like the risk of it being like bigger barriers between like that technology and the access that it has to those that are like most marginalized. And I think that there are just so many connections that these institutions have to how the state kind of like creates like its economy and how it like sutures and justifies its own existence, that there are actually a lot of ways that you can kind of start to put together like versions of link arguments, even if they're kind of like centered around the same couple of ideals, and that actually then come out like more diverse than like an understanding of accelerationism, where you're both doing the indict of just like all of the kind of like top level like capitalistic investments that the affirmative have, and then like also adding that into like arguments you have about the way in which the affirmative envisions a certain idea for what the future is. Because I think that as you go on in the debate, and this is the thing that I think is especially powerful about this link debate, is that you'll hear teams talk about like the way in which the 1AC kind of like have like the 1NC is like too pessimistic towards the state, and why like open kind of futurity is like better and allows us to more efficiently like plan for various types of scenarios. But I think that you can make an argument about why that's overly pessimistic in the capability of the creation of new institutions, and why it ontologizes or makes permanent the way in which we think about like the state as is in its place within like society. And I think that then being able to use those as arguments that make not only like offensive turns against the AF, but differences between the alternative and the link arguments that you'll need later on, is a really important place for you to kind of like sit with a lot of this offense that you want to create on the link debate. Because then when you kind of like transition to go into like this permutation portion of the debate, I think that you have a really good job of being able to both bring out like a lot of examples and a lot of like warranted explanation of what the alternative looks like without biting yourself back into the permutation, which I feel like is something that I warn against with a lot of other criticisms. I think that sometimes when I talk about a lot of other criticisms, I explain that like the more kind of like broad that you get with your examples, the more ways the AF can kind of like permute the different types of like examples that you're bringing up. And I think that that is probably still true of like accelerationism at some level, right? That like the more permutation arguments or examples that you make of what different types of tech or redistribution looks like, the more the affirmative could offer like ways in which the state could like make that possible, or ways in which policy can make that possible. But I also think at the same time, when you really have this kind of like strong analysis of like why the state's kind of role like predisposes us to believe like that there's a kind of like naturalized order that makes the marginalization inevitable, and there's so many good arguments about why the permutation wouldn't be able to function or be able to take up the type of radicality of the affirmative. And I think that within that kind of like left-leaning accelerationist literature, there's so much arguments about how like the state and the cultural memory that it produces kind of informs us or seduces us to believe in its like eventuality and the necessity of its eventuality. And I think that this portion of the debate allows you to really sit on why that's not only like not true, but also something that like creates a really dangerous narrative about how we relate to the state and the way in which we think about like the role that it serves, and like how we kind of orient and organize ourselves as like a society, and like the way in which we think about how people relate to it as an institution. I think then when you're moving on to the question of impact comparison, this is a place where I feel like you have so many good arguments about why the type of arguments and the impacts that will be centered around the water resolution in terms of things that have to do with like the economy, the environment, etc., all I think have really good impact modules that are good at the paces of accelerationism, because you can both critique the way in which the idea of like these future apocalyptic notions of what the future would look like if the policy doesn't pass is meant to kind of continue that ontologization, that monopolization of like our vision of what the future can be and the state's role in it. But you can also make arguments about how like there's this inevitable kind of like presence or like this inevitable kind of like form of violence that accompanies our ability to organize no matter what, if we don't radically kind of like diffuse ourselves or radically disavow ourselves from the way in which we kind of like invest into capitalism and its dispossession and the status quo, which I think then allows you to make a lot of arguments at the level of like magnitude and scale that I think your alternative can both do theoretically if you're able to kind of like explain it and pitch it in the right way. But I think that you can flip what a lot of policy teams are comfortable with in the terms of the magnitude question of making arguments about how like the kind of commitment to like the world in which we know it now and like the kind of like refusal to take up accelerationism only makes like environmental catastrophe inevitable, only makes the collapse of the market inevitable, because these are kind of innate to the process of how like capitalism is crafted, which is why when you kind of like switch to the alternative portion of the debate and you start to push really hard on the question of if that is true, then like what is the most like radical version of the world that we could take up in order to kind of like diffuse this possibility or look for other possibilities, you have a lot of arguments to make in terms of like how people have organized themselves outside of the state and how they've organized themselves differentially to the government. And that allows you to come up with like not a foundational basis for this is what the alternative is, but this is what the tactics look like in terms of what the alternative could be with the like way in which we're thinking about the current technology and other things that are proposed in front of us. Hopefully this video was helpful for you, and hopefully you'll tune into more videos I'll be doing talking about accelerationism, because I really like this series and I think it'll be really interesting on the resolution coming up. Thanks.